Friday, December 12th, 1997. Amarillo, Texas. 11:30 p.m. Tension was building in the parking lot. Elise Thompson could see it through the window of the booth she was sitting in at the local IHOP. She watched her good friend, Rob Mansfield, as he walked inside and came toward her booth. Elise had come inside the restaurant to talk with a few friends because the scene in the parking lot was starting to feel chaotic with everyone buzzing about the fight. There were teens all around, many inside the restaurant, but many more were outside. Elise liked coming to these big late-night hangouts, even if there was talk of a fight going down. Fights were often supposed to happen at these things, but rarely ever did. This was just where everyone came on Friday nights, after football games, or even in summertime. Elise wasn't one of the popular kids, really, but she could be a social butterfly when she felt like it. And at IHOP on Friday nights, she felt like it. Rob approached the booth and put his hand on her shoulder. He leaned down and said, "We're leaving." As she followed Rob out of the restaurant, Elise saw that there were still some small mounds of snow in the parking lot. It was December and cold. Elise could see that things had escalated pretty heavily in the 10 minutes or so she'd been inside the IHOP. It was loud. There were cars and kids everywhere. Kids that she knew from her own school, kids she knew went to the other school, kids that had already graduated from school. The parking lot was a mess of bodies, and the boys were squaring up to each other. Some of Elise's own friends were standing chest to chest with some of the punk kids in town. Elise and her friends called them the Freaks. One of them was really tall and scary looking, and Elise jumped when she heard him shout something and pull out one of those police stick things. He was waving it around and yelling, "Come on." The freak next to him said, "I know we can take him. I just know we can take him." When his friend John King flipped open his expandable police baton, Brian Deneke knew that the fight was on. There was no turning back now. He and all of his friends, the punk rockers who came to the IHOP every weekend, were finally going to have it out with the white hats. After years of abuse, being punched and spat on and called freaks, Brian and his friends were going to even the score. When Brian heard, "I just know we can take him," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a massive chain with a heavy lock attached to one end. He pushed his mohawk back with his hand and rolled his head around to crack his neck. Adrenaline was taking over. There were about a dozen punks there tonight, 4 of them girls. They were outnumbered. Brian could see that. There must have been at least 30 jocks there, maybe 50. Even more if you counted all the girls. Brian could feel the large group of jocks beginning to flank him and his friends. If they didn't act fast, they were going to be surrounded. The white hats had bats and clubs too. It looked like something out of a movie. Elise didn't see how it started. It just started. Punching and kicking and shoving, clumsy grappling and bodies falling over. Little pockets of action sprang up throughout the parking lot. It seemed like half a dozen mini-fights rather than one big brawl. But it was a brawl. Elise had never seen anything like it. Glass was shattering, clubs and bats were connecting with thudding sounds. There were bloody noses and bloody mouths, missing teeth and fists full of hair. It felt like a movie or a dream. Rob shook her out of it. "Come on, we're getting back in the car." Rob and Elise trotted over to Dustin Camp's Cadillac. Dustin sat in the driver's seat. He swung open the passenger door for Elise and Rob and then fired up the engine. Dustin peeled his Cadillac out of the parking spot, tires screeching. Elise climbed into the back seat, and she had to steady herself by putting her hands on the front seats. Dustin was driving fast. Despite the wild driving, Elise was relieved to be leaving the scene. As Dustin pulled the car out of the parking lot, he saw the mob of fighting teens streaming across the street to Western Plaza Shopping Center. Elise was frightened. Instead of driving away, Dustin accelerated and went after the mob. Brian Deneke ran across Western Avenue. Waves of kids followed him, some in cars, some on foot. Brian looked to his left. He saw his punk friend Chris Oles trapped in the median of Western Ave. Chris was almost mowed down by some white hats in a red blazer. John King swung his police baton and smashed out a rear window on the blazer. Brian felt a hand pull the back of his shirt to turn him around. Brian turned back and swung at the jocks who were grabbing at him. And at that moment, Brian saw Chris Oles rolling off the hood of a large Cadillac. Elise cringed and covered her eyes as Dustin Camp slowly drove into the mob on Western Avenue. He hit one of the freaks from behind. Not hard, more like a nudge, but with enough inertia to send the kid up onto the hood. The freak rolled off the hood, more surprised than hurt. He landed on his feet. Elise cried out as some of the freaks started beating on Dustin's car with clubs and chains. Suddenly, Dustin accelerated, and Elise was sucked back into her seat. Dustin hopped the median and stepped on the gas. When Elise pulled herself back up to see out of the windshield, she saw a freak with a spiky mohawk running away. Dustin bore down on the kid and blurted out, "I'm a ninja in my caddy." Brian Deneke was running as fast as he could. The Cadillac was heading straight at him. There was nothing to get behind to protect himself. All he could do was run. He ran, but not fast enough. He turned around. Elise heard a soft, sickening thud as the car hit the kid. His body flopped onto the hood for a split second and was then sucked under. Elise felt one bump and then another. She turned to look out the back window and saw a crumpled heap of a body, limbs splayed and blood all over the pavement. A girl was screaming and running toward the body. Dustin Camp said, "I bet he liked that," and continued to drive away. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Jordan Crittenden here. Welcome back to another episode of Dark Dark World. In the early 90s, as a young teenager, I found punk rock. It became the defining music of my teens. But punk is more than a genre of music. It's an attitude. It's a community. It's a sense of belonging. It's a place to go. A place for misfit kids. Kids who don't feel comfortable in their own skin. I was one of those kids. When I found punk, I found that it was okay to not play sports. It was okay to not be popular. It was okay that I had acne and was chubby and insecure. Punk told me that it was okay to be me. And I think one thing that can happen when punk sort of becomes your thing and you get deep into it, you start wearing the clothes and listening to all the bands. You start to really see yourself as different. Different from all the other people who don't know about punk and don't get it. Punk fosters an us against them mentality. That mentality didn't start with punk, it's ages old. Think of the Outsiders, the Greasers and the Socias, West Side Story, the Jets and the Sharks. Even Romeo and Juliet had the vibe. And as I said, punk certainly didn't create the vibe. But punk does put a pretty fine point on it. So much of the music focuses on it. Perhaps it's not surprising that all of the stories I just mentioned involve teenagers. At no other time in life is the us against them mentality more prevalent than in high school. High school is where and when everybody is learning about their own identity, looking to find where it is they might belong. I had punk, that's where my identity formed. Other kids had it too. Some kids got their identities from being athletes. Some focused on schoolwork. But we were all finding our way through a confusing time. I quote one of my favorite punk bands of the time, Rancid. "There wasn't always a place to go, but there was always an urgent need to belong." End quote. And as a teen, with punk, I found belonging. Other teens did too. Brian Deneke was one of those kids. He got into punk at about the same time, in the early 90s as a young teen. And like me, he was from the Southwest. Although while I was growing up in a thriving metropolis at the time, Phoenix, Arizona, Brian Deneke was growing up in Amarillo, Texas. It was tougher to be a punk in a place like that. The social tribes that existed there at the time were rigidly defined. For the teenagers of Amarillo, the us against them trope was something very real. And in December of 1997, when Brian Deneke was murdered, run down by a car as he was trying to run away, the city of Amarillo would be forced to deal with that reality. Brian Deneke was born in 1978. He and his older brother Jason were born in Wichita, Kansas, to parents Mike and Betty. The family moved to Amarillo, Texas in 1981. As an elementary school student, Brian Deneke was a member of the Boy Scouts of America. He did well in school, but as he grew older, his interests changed. He and his brother developed unusual tastes in music and fashion, and fell deeply in love with skateboarding. Mike and Betty Deneke allowed their boys to build ramps in their backyard, and the boys would spend the entire day out there skating. Brian's passion for skateboarding consumed his life. When his scoutmaster took his skateboard and threw it out the door during a scout meeting, Brian became enraged and possibly considered lashing out at his scoutmaster. Instead, he just left the Boy Scouts. He went on to leave high school, too. At the age of 17, Brian dropped out of Amarillo High School and got his GED. With skateboarding comes music, and in the 90s, skaters typically chose one of two genres to be the soundtrack for their shredding: hip-hop or punk rock. For Brian Deneke, it was punk rock, and he connected to it with such passion that eventually he stopped skating. He focused solely on punk, the music, the fashion, the ethos. Soon Brian had a mohawk. Sometimes it was green, sometimes blue. He wore spikes and chains and dog collars. Patches of bands adorned his pants and jackets. The lyrics of songs by his favorite bands appeared all over his possessions. Lines from the Subhumans, Naked Aggression, Filth, GBH, Blank 77 were written on books, walls, even his thermal underwear. Brian loved these bands, and he wanted them to come play in Amarillo. He became the city's de facto punk show promoter. Brian's close friend, John King, you remember the one with the expandable police baton, said, quote, he'd write him and ask him to play here as many times as it took for them to finally agree. He'd take the money out of his own pocket and he'd rent a place for them to play. End quote. Brian didn't play any instruments, but he longed to form his own band. He decided he would be the singer and rounded up some friends to form the band The White Slave Traders. Now, I'm not certain about this, but given what I've been able to dig up on Brian Deneke and his views, and the views of bands that he loved, this band's name probably should have been Traders of White Slaves. I mean, I say should have, both names are terrible. It's just that white slave traders to me suggests white people who trade in slaves. I don't think that's what Brian meant it to be. I think he meant for the name to conjure up images of white people being the slaves. And in Amarillo, Texas, that idea would certainly go a long way as far as its ability to piss off the locals. And I think that's probably what Brian was going for. I'm not certain, but he wanted his band to be provocative. He wanted to incite outrage. And he often did. In 1999, in a piece for the Dallas Observer, journalist Julie Lyons wrote, quote, intimidation had become such a fixture in Brian Deneke's life that he'd earned the nicknames Punch, as in human punching bag, and Fist Magnet. End quote. Brian's father, Mike Deneke, claimed that Brian, quote, took a lot of verbal and physical abuse from people. We tried to explain to him that if you dress that way, have your hair that way, people are going to act negative toward you. And that's just the way it is. And he'd say it's not right, they shouldn't. And he's right, they shouldn't. But people do. End quote. Brian and his friends were picked on, and worse. Called freaks by most of the non-punks at school and around town, the punks were regularly ducking to avoid things being thrown at them from cars. They were sometimes slapped, punched, spat on. Journalist Julie Lyons again. Quote, "They'll tell you it's tough being a punk in the Panhandle. All of the kids in the lifestyle, and that includes goths and skinheads, complain about the harassment they regularly face from Amarillo's stead citizenry. Just this morning, Matt Bohannon, an iron-pumping 27-year-old with a shaved head, was run off the road on his bike by a posse of white hats in a Mustang," he says. Some time ago, Julie Holyfield got a car stereo lobbed at her head while she was walking down the street. The guys who threw it missed, but barely. End quote. While the punks were called freaks by the jocks and many others, the punks called the jocks white hats because of the jocks' predilection for wearing white baseball caps with the names of Ivy League colleges printed across the front. Despite the frequent harassment, Brian Deneke stayed positive. His friends said that he, quote, "possessed a personal magnetism that separated him from his peers," end quote. A past girlfriend of Brian's, Jennifer Hicks, said, quote, "He had a really positive, outgoing personality. Instead of sitting on his ass, he'd rather do something. He was real fun," end quote. Julie Lyons also wrote, quote, "That energy and charm fit perfectly with his role as Amarillo's 19-year-old punk impresario. He lured bands from as far away as LA, put on his own shows, and got to know just about everyone whose musical tastes ventured into the margins. The punks repeatedly talk about his ability to generate excitement out of nothing. And Amarillo, they remind you, is pretty close to nothing on the thrill spectrum." Daniel Kelso, who worked with Deneke, identifies him as the chief figure behind Amarillo's punk scene and explains his unusual charisma. Brian was probably the most self-aware, self-realized, and happy-go-lucky 19-year-old I've ever run into. He was always in a good mood, always smiling, even when bad shit happened. On December 6th, 1997, a week before Brian Deneke was killed, Chris Oles, one of Brian's punk friends, walked to the bathroom inside the IHOP restaurant where the punks like to hang out late night on weekends. In the side room, a group of jocks sat at a table, and as Chris made his way to the bathroom, an altercation developed. Chris claims that the white hats simply started harassing him as usual. One of the jocks, Justin DeVore, claims that it was Chris who started it by pulling up his shirt to reveal a knife handle. Things escalated when John King and Dustin Camp got in each other's faces. You remember John King and his police baton, and you remember Dustin Camp with his Cadillac. Camp jabbed his finger into King's chest. King admittedly had a short fuse. He shoved Camp backwards, hard. Chris Oles grabbed King to keep him from doing more, and one of Camp's friends discouraged Camp from further retaliation and hustled him out the door. Outside of the restaurant now, Chris Oles saw Brian Deneke and greeted him. John King, however, approached Dustin Camp at his Cadillac, and the two exchanged some more words. Camp reversed his car and peeled out of his parking spot. He put the car in drive and floored it. A punk friend of Brian Deneke's, Kendra Pettit, recalls, quote, "He came up behind the punks. I'll never know how they moved in time. It all happened so fast, but they had to jump out of the way. He was trying to hit them. He had floored it. His tires were screeching." End quote. As Dustin Camp flew past the punks, John King busted out one of the Cadillac's windows with his baton. Now the stage was set. In the days that followed, the kids at Tascosa High School and the kids at Amarillo High School talked about an upcoming fight. Rumors buzzed all around town. The jocks and the punks were going to have it out on Friday night at the IHOP. Friday, December 12th came, and Elise Thompson went out with her friend Rob. They did the usual, house hopping, playing some pool, drinking some beers. Everyone was talking about the big fight that was going to happen later on. At around 11 p.m., Elise and Rob got into Dustin Camp's car, and they headed over to the IHOP where people were said to be gathering for the fight. The punks had heard the rumors too, and they were talking about the fight, drinking beers and psyching themselves up. Some of them had been there on the previous Friday night when King and Camp had gotten into it at the IHOP. They knew there was a good chance that more was coming, and so they headed back to the IHOP. To this day, there is much dispute over how the fight started on the night of Brian Deneke's death. It seems that no one really knows. There were just so many kids there, so many teens jacked up and itching for a fight. Once the fighting broke out, it was chaos. Several pockets of localized fighting popped up throughout the parking lot. Some kids were still in their cars, driving around trying to navigate the mess. Punks were on the ground being kicked and punched. Jocks were on the ground being kicked and punched. Everyone was swinging weapons. The punks were vastly outnumbered. And despite probably having more weapons than the jocks, they simply couldn't make up the difference. They had to retreat. Many of the punks began running away, some of the jocks chasing after them. Dustin Camp opted to chase after them in his Cadillac. After all, as Camp said, "I'm a ninja in my caddy." Brian Deneke was running away. Elise Thompson recalled seeing the terror in his eyes. Dustin Camp ran him down and ran him over. And then he drove away. Those of Brian Deneke's friends who witnessed his death remember it distinctly, though the details of each friend's memories don't always match up with each other. Chris Oles recalled, quote, "You know those lowrider cars? That's what it looked like. It just went over the top of him and bounced. You know what the scary thing was? After he ran over him, they all started cheering." End quote. Jennifer Hicks said, quote, "Blood was coming out of every hole in his head. He got squished. There was blood like from his nose, ears, and mouth. I felt like I was in a movie or something, like it was fake. All these Christian people were like saying prayers, and I said, man, he's fucking dead. He's dead. He's dead." End quote. John King said, quote, "He was saying something, but I don't think anyone understood it. There was all of us surrounding him, and Jason, Brian's brother, was like holding him in his lap. There was blood everywhere. Tons of blood." End quote. The dead body of Brian Deneke lay in a patch of snow against the median that Dustin Camp had hopped in his car. His teeth were broken. His face was gashed. Autopsy would later reveal that Brian's skull, spine, pelvis, and ribs had been crushed. By the time the Cadillac pulled up to Rob Mansfield's house, Dustin Camp was crying. He was talking incessantly, saying that he'd made a mistake. Rob and Elise Thompson got out of the car and said goodnight to each other as Dustin Camp drove away. At their respective homes, Elise and Rob woke their parents and told them what had happened. One set of parents called the other on the phone, and both families agreed that they needed to go to the police station immediately. Together, the families went downtown to the police station, where Rob and Elise both gave statements. When Dustin Camp arrived home that night, he woke his parents and told them what had happened. They told Dustin to go to sleep, and that they would deal with it in the morning. In her article, Julie Lyons described this as, quote, "a misstep by Camp that would seem to indicate a callous nonchalance about Brian Deneke's death." End quote. On Saturday morning, the police came to the Camp house with a search warrant. The Cadillac was seized. The police gathered 10 swabbings of possible blood, 2 hairs and/or fibers, bits of paint, and from the trunk an almost empty bottle of Crown Royal whiskey and an 18-pack of Bud Light, with 13 cans missing. Dustin Camp was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, Dustin Camp was represented by a defense lawyer named Warren L. Clark. Clark described the trial as one that, quote, split the community of Amarillo right down the middle. End quote. On the witness stand, punks and jocks took turns telling their stories. The testimony of the punks differed from the testimony of the jocks. Warren Clark did his best to make it appear that the jocks were telling the truth and that the punks were liars. Clark portrayed Brian Deneke and his friends as goons, thugs, and sociopaths, while he portrayed Dustin Camp as a, quote, good, solid, and normal kid, passionate about Amarillo's favorite institutions, family and football, end quote. The defense strategy for Dustin Camp was simple and sadly effective. Demonize the victim, valorize the defendant. Warren Clark held up Brian Deneke's leather jacket as an exhibit of evidence. On the jacket, Brian had attached a patch with safety pins. The patch read, "Destroy everything." Said Warren Clark, quote, "Destroy everything. Is this the message we want to send to our children for generations to come? This is what that weapon-wielding goon wore the night of the altercation. Looks to me like he was on a mission to kill." End quote. In fact, Destroy Everything is merely an epithet from one of Brian's favorite punk bands, Filth. According to Brian's friends, to Brian, destroy everything meant to tear down preconceived notions, to search for truth, to reject a system that oppresses those who seem different. To Brian, the entire essence of what punk meant to him and to so many others was best summed up in those two words: destroy everything. But tragically, in Amarillo in the 1990s, the social system that oppressed Brian Deneke and his friends was too powerful for them to reject. Dustin Camp walked free, convicted only of voluntary manslaughter, and sentenced to probation and a $10,000 fine, also probated. Brian Deneke's friend, David True, said, quote, "It's bullshit, complete inanity, that someone caught burglarizing a house or selling drugs in this town can go to prison for 20 years, but for taking another human being's life, he gets 10 years probation." End quote. Defense attorney Warren Clark claimed that the trial and the verdict split the community down the middle. But in reality, the majority accepted the results. In addition to Brian Deneke's family and friends, there were a number of Amarillo residents who were outraged after Dustin Camp was sentenced. But by and large, the community shrugged and turned focus back to family and football. Dustin Camp did end up going to prison, years later in 2001, for a variety of probation violations. He served 5 years and was released in 2006. From her article in the Dallas Observer, Julie Lyons said, quote, "The Camp trial came at a time when Amarillo's prejudice, indignation, and grief had bled onto the letter page of the local newspaper and manifested itself in numerous incidents of intimidation involving both jocks and punks." End quote. Elise Thompson said, quote, "I think it's just human nature. I think in all high schools across America, there's the stereotypes. And in general, high school kids are just really intolerant of differences." End quote. And that will do it for today's story about Brian Deneke, Dustin Camp, the white hats and the freaks, the jocks and the punks, the Montagues and the Capulets and the Socs and the Greasers and the Jets and the Sharks. It's a tragic story. It's one I'm not going to editorialize on too much. I think I gave you enough at the beginning with my punk rock history. If you would like to become a Dark individual and support the show at Patreon, please do so by going to patreon.com/darkdarkworld. It would be greatly appreciated. If you're enjoying the show, please tell your friends about it. Tell them to listen. And if you've got time, write a review. If you think it's really good, maybe give it 5 stars. That would be really helpful. I think that's all I've got for now. Keep coming back, people. I really appreciate you listening to the show. Talk to you soon.
See ya!